the Rise Up See Red podcast, all about the Arizona Cardinals and the NFL, featuring insider and outsider perspectives. Enjoy the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web. Now here are your hosts, Jess Root and Seth Cox.
Hello, Arizona Cardinals fans, and welcome to the latest edition of the Rise Up See Red podcast, best hour of Cardinals talk on the web. I'm your host, Jess Root from CardsWire.com, USA Today's NFL Wire site that covers, of course, your Arizona Cardinals, as we are in the middle of our opponent preview series, something we've been doing every summer for the last several years. And one of the Cardinals' opponents this season will be in Week 17. They will take on the Las Vegas Raiders. And many of us are pegging as a perhaps by that point will be the rematch of Fernando Mendoza against Carson Beck, the national championship game rematch by that point. But to talk about the Raiders, look back at their 2025, look at what they did the offseason and kind of what they're expected to do in 2026. Joining me is Raiders Wire lead writer Levi Damien, a guy who has been kind of on the same path as I have for a long time. Before I joined the NFL Wire at USA Today, I was over at SB Nation, and that is where Levi comes from as well. Levi, how you been? Thank you for coming on the show. I really appreciate it.
Oh, of course. Yeah, I've been great. It's been an interesting offseason, that's for sure.
Yeah, for sure. The Raiders last season, they were not good, but honestly, they had the same record as the Cardinals, but finished as the number one pick in the draft. They go 3-14. They're last place in the NFC West. They were dead last in offense, scoring 14 points a game. Tell me, how much worse was last year than what was expected?
A lot worse, actually, because Pete Carroll came in as not the number one choice for the head coach, but maybe the fallback option. And they thought, hey, you can get a proven head coach out of retirement, if you want to call it that. He said he was never, actually retired, but people kind of thought of him as that. And he was bringing Geno Smith with him in the trade. Brought in Chip Kelly, made him the highest paid coordinator in the NFL. There was a lot of high hopes, and Pete Carroll's a great guy. He's really likable. He still runs around the practices and stuff like that. And I say likable, he's likable in terms of he's a player's coach. He's likable by the media. Everybody really thought that the Raiders were going to be turning a corner in the right way. And I don't think anyone predicted the epic collapse that they had that season, last season. So yeah, it was a pretty big surprise.
Yeah, they were held to 10 or fewer points 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 times last year. Not good. Now, which is kind of interesting because I, for one, was critical of the move that the Seahawks made when they decided to move off of Geno to go on to Sam Darnold, because Geno had been playing at a pretty consistent level. And I thought basically it was a lateral move going from just a younger version of Geno Smith. Turns out that the Seahawks won on both bets. Geno was not good last year, and Sam Darnold was great. Based on the play from Geno Smith last year, who's now moved on, is now with the New York Jets, where he started his career. How much of the problems offensively were on Geno and his play declining, and how much of it was just stuff that was going around him, talent-wise, scheme-wise, and other bits and pieces that we've kind of heard about when it came to the offense?
That's a really good question, honestly, because what I saw from Geno Smith, and it's kind of what I always seen from him, is he is not usually the problem, but he's also not like the answer. He can't put a team on his back. He can take a decent team and not make them worse, maybe make them a little better for his solid QB play. If you remember correctly, he was in that system in Seattle for 2 years before he took over. So he came into a very comfortable, very well-versed in everything. It goes back to what we just said a second ago, that we thought with him coming in with Pete Carroll that he was going to slide right in kind of the similar situation. But what happened with the offense was mostly the problem of, in part because Chip Kelly was came in with his own system, and Pete Carroll wouldn't even really let him run that system. So there's a lot of kind of like push-pull happening. And then Pete Carroll also named his son the offensive line coach, and the offensive line was just an absolute shambles. They were coaching each other, like the players were coaching each other because, Brendan Carroll was, kind of falling down on the job, if you will. And so what happened was a team was falling apart, and he only exacerbated the problem because he just doesn't have the ability to take a bad situation and make it not as bad. He just made it worse because he took too many sacks. He made a lot of bad decisions based on the pressure that he was getting. And then his attitude came with that. He just shut down with the media. He quite literally flipped off the fans in his home stadium. He was just a mess. He could not handle the adversity that came with the problems that they were having. So he wasn't the source of it all, but he just made it worse. And so they kind of fed on each other, the problems with the offense and the problems with him. And it just, all the wheels came off completely.
Ashton Jeanty, number 10 pick last year, top 10 pick a year ago. Not the rookie year that people wanted. And I look at Ashton Jeanty, and I firmly look at what the Cardinals did with Jeremiah Love, same type of talent I see there. Jeanty, not the dominant season many hoped, 3.7 yards a carry, 975 yards rushing, but still was productive. How much of that, like, is there the belief that Ashton Jeanty is still going to be great? Or again, were the problems that they had, or his lack of big production, more because he just couldn't get into the open field?
I don't think it was a matter of him, because he's not the type of back who needs to get in the open field. He can create open field himself, but he couldn't even get to the line of scrimmage before he saw contact. One of the more amazing stats we saw during the season, I believe it was after week 4, but it might have been even later in the season, where he had them. I don't think I'd ever seen a stat like this. And I mean, I'm sure it's existed, but he had more yards after contact than he had total yards rushing. And it's because he routinely was seeing contact in the backfield and having to break a tackle before he'd ever even gotten to the line of scrimmage. And so most of the time he was able to break that first tackle, but sometimes he wasn't. And even if he was, I mean, he'd see a second, guy within a yard or so. So he was having to really sift through the rubble before he'd even gotten to the point where he could start to make positive yardage. And there's no running back in the NFL that can survive, let alone thrive in that kind of situation. I think a lot of people saw flashes here and there when he actually was given at least the ability to get to the line of scrimmage so we could start to pick up some speed, or if you will. And then he could still, he did, I believe if you look at his broken tackle rate, it was among the best in the league. He could still break tackles. It's just the fact that he had to break too many of them in either in negative yardage situations or, around the line of scrimmage. And so that's the main reason why he struggled so much. But if you look at what his abilities are, and you could see moments where he can not only juke defenders, but he can also drive through defenders to get a couple more yards. And you saw that in flashes, like I said, with the Raiders offense and their offensive line in particular being so terrible. You didn't get a chance to see enough of it, but you saw those moments where you could be like, okay, if this guy even gets a competent offensive line, in particular, a competent offensive line coach, so that the offensive linemen aren't completely lost out there, which they often were, then he can probably do some pretty good numbers.
Brock Bowers didn't get to play the full season, missed time with injury. Were there, on the defensive side of the ball, were there any positives, and what were the biggest disappointments on the defensive side of the ball?
Oh, okay. You mentioned Brock Bowers, but on the defensive side of the ball, I mean, it kind of goes back to what's been the problem a lot of the time the last few years is this Max Crosby and everyone else. And especially when it comes to pass rush, he has had almost no help from the other side in his time with the Raiders. And in particular, last season and the season before that, you had, for instance, Malcolm Kuntz 2 years ago was coming off. It was streaking at the end of the season. He had 8 sacks in 9 games, and he came into the season or out of camp as the starter across from Crosby, and they thought like they might have something in him. And then he got injured just before the season in practice and missed the entire season. And so that's how he went into free agency. So they re-signed him to a 1-year deal because they thought, okay, this guy's got potential when he's healthy, and he certainly didn't want to enter free agency coming off of the missed season. And so they thought, okay, this was last season. In 2025, they're going to get another shot at it with Crosby and Kuntz on each side. But Kuntz clearly was not completely back. I mean, I think he was healthy. It just was one of those things where I think his injury might have been an ACL, where he needed another season before he was going to be back to his old self. And then they just had a rotation of kind of practice squad guys essentially on that other side. So it was, and Max Crosby makes up for a lot of flaws, but that and the fact that they had everything was cobbled together. They had 3 cast-off linebackers, Landon Roberts, Devin White, and Jamal Adams, who was obviously a former great safety who was playing linebacker, all of whom were on a 1-year deal. So they had, they weren't expecting much for them, and they didn't get much from them. And then they had a rookie and a former undrafted guy who were battling at one of the corner spots. And usually it was like, okay, you're terrible, I'll put you in. Okay, you're terrible, put the other guy back in type of situation. The only real positives you saw on the defense were, aside from Max Crosby, were Jeremy Chin at safety and Eric Stokes at one of the cornerback spots. And that's 3 guys on a full defense where everybody else is underwhelming, underperforming, or just downright terrible. And that's they completely revamped that defense this season from that. They brought back Stokes because he was the biggest pleasant surprise last season. He was their best cornerback, and then they drafted 4 defensive backs in the draft. They brought in 2 proven young starters at linebacker. Then they signed Kwity Paye, brought back Malcolm Kuntz again, and hopefully, trying to maybe get something from him. And then and drafted Kieran Walker in the 3rd round to and it's not Walker, Kieran, there's my name thing. In the 3rd round to enter the rotation.
It was Crawford. It's Crawford.
Crawford. There you go. I'm like it's Quay Walker. Anyway, so Kieran Crawford. So they have basically what looks like a pretty decent rotation at that defensive end spot across from Crosby. So if you just look at, then the one kind of weak area is the interior defensive line, where they have lots of depth, but very little in the way of proven starters. No dominant presence on the interior defensive line. That's where their big issue is going to be, I think. But everything else, they seem to have really upgraded.
And with that, let's move on to what they did in the offseason. So coming up next on the Rise Up Secret podcast, Best of Cardinals Talk on the Web, we'll talk about the coaching change, free agency, and the draft. That's coming up next on Rise Up Secret. We're back on the Rise Up Secret podcast, Best of Cardinals Talk on the Web, talking to Levi Damien from Raiders Wire as we look at the Cardinals' Week 17 opponent, the Las Vegas Raiders, at State Farm Stadium. We go into the offseason. Pete Carroll's let go. They bring in the young hot coordinator in Klint Kubiak. What is the feeling about Kubiak coming off of that season there with the Seahawks, the success that he had there, and then his coordinators, Andrew Janocko and Rob Leonard. What is the feeling about this group coming in as Kubiak's first-time head coach?
Well, the feeling is, first and foremost, they got, and honestly, is another one of those situations where I can't remember a time since I've been covering the Raiders, and this is 18 years now for me, that they got the top head coach in the cycle, and they waited it out. They waited. I think they had their eyes set on him for a while, but they waited it out to through the Super Bowl to get him, and they got the hot name. He was the offensive coordinator for the Super Bowl champions, and he's a second generation head coach with his dad Gary being a head coach and a coordinator for many, many years. And he also brings with him a lot of guys who he'd worked with before and who his dad had worked with before that he's familiar with, who are proven. Proven doesn't necessarily mean that they're guaranteed anything, but again, I always look at, like, they weren't like digging for scraps. They weren't going with their fallback option here. They got the guy they wanted, and he got a lot of the guys he wanted to come in. So that gives you your best shot when you come in with that. Like, everybody got who they wanted. Now let's see if it'll work. You mentioned Rob Leonard. He was like the main coach that was as returning. He was the defensive line coach, and he's promoted to defensive coordinator. He's very well respected in the building, in the league, and especially Max Crosby. They get along really well. They've worked together really well, and having him get the job, I think, was good. And it's a big job considering the head coach is an offensive guy. The defensive coordinator is basically calling kind of like a head coach in a way, because he's, in charge of the side of the ball that the head coach is not familiar with. And so, yeah, the feeling again is good. But unlike the Pete Carroll situation, it's not he's not past it. He's on the cusp of it. He's at the front of the line as opposed to at the end of his career. And Pete Carroll was great once, but the NFL moves quickly, and things change, and Kubiak is on the cusp of that. So that's a good, it's a good thing for them in this situation.
In free agency, they swap out quarterbacks. Geno Smith off to the Jets. They sign Kirk Cousins. They add offensive line. They add linebackers. Who are the biggest additions to the roster this offseason free agency for the Raiders?
Well, the big one is Tyler Linderbaum, the guy they spent like silly money, paid him like $7 million more than the previous highest paid center in the NFL. And they've caught a little grief for doing that, thinking, the overpaid situation. However, I look at it in two ways. First of all, they had a lot of money to spend. And second of all, they knew the guy they wanted more than anything. They wanted Linderbaum, and they were determined to beat out the Ravens, who were trying to re-sign him to get him. And so they just backed up the Brinks truck and got him. They wanted to make sure that they got their guy, and he's going to, and the reason why is because of Fernando Mendoza. They wanted to make sure that they had a proven center in place from day one for Mendoza to work with, on a long-term deal. So like to give him the best chance to succeed. And those, multiple Pro Bowl offensive linemen in their prime don't hit free agency very often. And so, sometimes you got to overpay. I think they absolutely overpaid, but I don't think by next year anybody's going to care or even be thinking about how much they paid for him, especially because they had the money to do it. Right.
They also had former 49ers guard Spencer Burford. Mm-hmm. They bring in a couple linebackers, and Kobe Dean from Philadelphia and Quay Walker from Green Bay. Um, anyone else of you mentioned Kwity Paye, the edge from the Colts, Benito Jones on the defensive interior previously with the Dolphins. How much better does the roster look just from their additions in free agency?
Well, you mentioned the linebackers. I think if you were to say like the next after Linderbaum, those two guys would be their next two biggest signings. I mean, they're actually former Georgia teammates, so they're very familiar with each other coming in there. And they were Georgia teammates with Eric Stokes, so there's a lot of familiarity between the three. If you want to go even farther, Brock Bowers was on the team with them at Georgia as well, so they got a lot of familiarity there. But that doesn't really matter. I mean, he's on the offense, but that would be the next two. But then the one guy I would say you didn't mention was Jalen Naylor, who comes over from Minnesota. He was the number 3 receiver there. So it remains to be seen whether he can, take on a number 2 receiver job with the Raiders or not, whether he's, he reached his ceiling. But he looks good. And I don't think they're expecting Stark. While they're expecting him to be able to handle a bit of a larger role than he had in Minnesota. But I think he'll add something too as the slot receiver on a team that Brock Bowers is the number 1 receiver as a tight end. But that wide receiver position, while we're talking about what they added, that's one of the main areas, the biggest area that they needed to add more and didn't. It's probably their biggest weakness is their overall talent and depth at the wide receiver spot. There's not a lot there. There's a lot of potential in like Jack Besh from last year's draft, but it's just potential at this point. So there's a lot to be done there.
Which brings us to the NFL draft, where it was known ever since the season ended it was going to be Fernando Mendoza. He goes number 1 overall. They also add defensive back Traden Stukes out of Arizona. Incredibly athletic dude. You mentioned Kieran Crawford, the pass rusher out of Auburn. Of those, are those the 3 guys? The list goes on. Tackle Krezun, cornerback Jermod McCoy, running back Mike Washington, safety Dalton Johnson, Hezekiah Massis, the cornerback Malik Benson, receiver Brandon Cleveland, DT in round 7. With the picks that they made, obviously Mendoza is the one that they're banking on. How soon? How long will it be? Will Mendoza start in week 1? Or if Cousins is the guy, at least to start, how long does he hold off Mendoza, do you think?
I'm giving it by midseason, and here's what I'm thinking. Where I'm thinking the Raiders could be at with this. And my prediction is that Cousins will start the season, but sometime within the first 8 games before the trade deadline, Mendoza is going to take over as the starter, and Kirk Cousins is going to get traded to a team that has an injury and needs somebody to carry the load for the rest of the season. Not necessarily in that order. I mean, the trade could happen and then Mendoza steps into the role, something like that. That's what I'm predicting is going to happen. I mean, Kirk Cousins is in the Business Hall of Fame here, and he took over this spot. I think he knows that there's a good chance that by the end of the season he could be on a playoff team just by virtue of the odds of things. He finished out last season as injury replacement, showing everybody that the previous season was due to his injury situation, that he hadn't really recovered from his previous injury, and if he comes out playing pretty decent, that he's an actual starter, like a worthy starter, he's going to be a valuable commodity, and the Raiders aren't going to want him sitting on the bench if he's got that kind of trade value. I mean, but Mendoza will, I think relatively quick study. I think by the time, we got a few games into the season, he's going to be, going to have gotten used to the offense and be ready to step in.
anyone in this draft class you see as a year one contributor this year?
Well, Jermod McCoy jumps out because he is a first round talent as a cornerback. He was considered a like top 3 at the position. He was on every draft board you could find. He was like early mid first round talent. The only reason he dropped is because of the concerns about his knee injury, that they say that he could need a surgery. If he needs a surgery and that surgery doesn't go well, even if the surgery goes well, he would be out for his rookie season. If it didn't go well, he could be his career could end. So nobody's gonna spend a day 1 or day 2 pick on a player with that kind of risk. But there's also a chance that he doesn't need a surgery, and there's a chance that if he does need a surgery, that he'd recover just fine. So come day 3, the Raiders traded up one spot to the top pick and on day 3 to get him. And if he is healthy, and they're taking him along slowly to make sure that they give him the best chance to be healthy, he has the talent to take over as a starting quarterback right now, especially on this team that last year I mentioned, the rookie cornerback, that's Darian Porter, who was battling with a former undrafted guy for the starting job to see who was worse. It wasn't who was better, it was who was worse situation. And so that spot is completely up for grabs, and McCoy could absolutely jump on it and take it right away if he's, obviously if he's healthy. He's the top guy. And then the next guy would be Traden Stukes, but merely by virtue of the fact that he was their high second round pick, and he could step in and either take a starting safety spot or maybe the nickel corner job.
Coming up next on the Rise Up Zero podcast, Best Our Cardinals Talk on the Web. Let's move on and talk about what expectations are for 2026. That's coming up next on Rise Up Zero. We're back on the Rise Up Zero podcast, Best Our Cardinals Talk on the Web, talking to Levi Damien of Raiders Wire. We look ahead to the 2026 season. They had the number 1 pick. They were one of the worst teams in the league, if not the worst team in the league. They play in a tough AFC West, where you've got the Chargers and the Broncos coming off playoff seasons, and even the Kansas City Chiefs are on a down year. Patrick Mahomes is coming back. What are reasonable expectations for this Raiders team in 2026?
I would say reasonable is also optimistic in this case, based on just, you look at their schedule and it's like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. It's like the highs of the roller coaster and the lows of it, because you have half their schedule against like strong playoff teams, and then you have more than half. In fact, I would say that they have a good 10 of their games are against really strong opponents, and then the other 7 opponents are some of the weaker teams in the league. So there's barely any in between. There might not be any in between. It's either the really good ones or the really bad ones. And so you're basically looking at, they're not going to beat these big time teams, except maybe by accident here and there. I had them winning 1 game against one of the playoff teams they face, and I'm not even super confident about that. And then I have them losing to a team that they probably should beat. And I think my prediction was, I think fairly optimistic at 7 wins. So 7-10, and they're just not going to do much, if any, better than that, because of the brutal opponents that they have.
They do, playing the NFC West this year. Granted, they've got the Cardinals on the schedule, and you probably look at that game. You look at that game, and you think the Cardinals look at that game, at least Cardinals fan look at that game against the Raiders as a could win, not a should win, but not. It's one of the winnable games on the schedule, and I would suppose that Raiders think about the Cardinals game in Week 17 in the same way, as a winnable game, could win, maybe should win.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would put the Cardinals as definitely I think it's one of those things where if you're covering the Cardinals, you would mark the Raiders game as a W, and vice versa. Just because if you're looking through the schedule and you're trying to make predictions, in both of these cases, the Cardinals and the Raiders being where they are in the power structure, you're looking for what games could they actually win. So you don't want to, I don't want to, I'm definitely not one of those writers who's trying to be optimistic. In fact, I mean, I end up having these kind of conversations with a lot of the Homer, if you will, Raiders, writers or people who cover. I could see them. I think they could squeak out 10 wins. And I'm like, no, I don't know what rose-colored glasses you're looking at.
That would be magic. That would be Fernando Mendoza magic.
I just mean like every season, I swear to God, I have this conversation with them. And every season I'm like, nope. And then it always ends up being that even my seemingly pessimistic or like outlook is still too optimistic for what ends up happening. And this I would be more optimistic if it weren't for how brutal their schedule is this year.
That's 100% true. I mean, Cousins isn't going to win you many games. He's capable. Mendoza's going to be a rookie. They still don't have a strong receiver presence. They've got Brock Bowers. They've got Rashan Genti. And so there's some building blocks there. They should be improved defensively. But ultimately, they're a last place team in a division that has three teams who expect to make the playoffs this year. And that's going to make it tough.
Yeah.
It's very much like the NFC West, where you've got the Rams, Seahawks, and 49ers. And then you've got the dumb dragon of the four dragons in that meme of the Cardinals. And it really is. It's kind of that way.
They're in the same boat.
They 100% the same boat. I would bet by that game, barring injury to either of them, it will be Mendoza versus Carson Beck, just like it was Indiana versus Miami in the national championship game. And that's something. So possible 7-win. That's an optimistic 7-win team that Levi's predicting for the Raiders, while I am struggling to find even 4 games for the Cardinals to win this coming season. Although I do have them beating the Raiders. The Raiders. I have them winning that. Well, granted, it's late in the year. The Cardinals have a Week 14 bye, and then their last the 3 games before it goes Jets, Saints, Raiders, and then 49ers in Week 18. If they haven't gone to Carson Beck by then, I think they will, and that's kind of the perfect place to put him in against. There's 3 winnable, not sure win games, but winnable games for the Cardinals right in a row with the Jets, Saints, and Raiders, and then a Week 18 game that might not mean anything for San Francisco. So,
there you go. Yeah,
that who knows? Not that I expect them to win all those games. I don't think they will, but yeah, I think the Cardinals a 4-win team. They're going to be kind of the same boat as the Raiders. Only Raiders, they have a better. Seemingly have the better coaching candidate. They have the better quarterback prospect. And as well, they seem to be a little bit farther ahead with what they did in free agency. But Levi, tons of thanks for you coming on the show. That'll wrap up this edition of the show. Levi, where can my listeners find your work? Is it just at Raiders Wire, anywhere else that we can find it?
Just at Raiders Wire. It's my only gig.
All right, man. Well, thank you so much for your time. We have more shows coming up, either in the form of opponent previews or with Seth Cox joining me for the regular shows as we gear up for training camp, or we're in training camp. And until then, that's Levi Damien. I'm Jess Root. Thanks for listening. As always, we'll be back again soon.
Thanks for listening to the latest edition of the Rise Up, See Red podcast. Listen to previous episodes and subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher Radio, Audioboom, or many other podcast platforms, so shows are delivered directly to your mobile device. Please give the show a 5-star rating and always support the sponsors who support the show. We'll be back soon for the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web. Rise up, Red Sea, be red, see red, and of course, rise up, see red.